Now listening, I know that title got some of y'all hell sitting up straight already. Why he chose her over me. Oh yeah, we gonna talk about it today. Let's see. Some of y'all been losing sleep, scrolling Instagram, looking at her pictures, wondering what she got that you don't. Some of y'all been hurt, confused, maybe even angry. But baby, let me tell you something. It ain't always what you think it is. Because sometimes, hear me now, sometimes the reason he chose her ain't got nothing to do with her being better. Thing to attempt. It's got EVRYNG to do where you are in your journey and where you keep setting the bar for yourself. He didn't choose her. He chose his comfort zone. Now let that sink in for a moment. This ain't about her being pretty funnier or somehow better than you. This is about a man choosing what's easy, what's familiar, what doesn't challenge him to level up. See, comfort is a cozy place, but nothing grows there. And when a man is faced with the kind of woman who demands growth, who makes him confront himself, who expects consistency, communication, healing either rises or retreats. And too often he retreats. A lot of women think, what does she have that I don't? The better question is, what did she let him stay that you didn't? Because let's be real, some women will let a man be lazy, emotionally unavailable, non-committal, and inconsistent and call that love. But you were holding him accountable. You had vision. You had boundaries. You were asking for depth, for plans, for purpose. You were triggering his growth. And that ain't comfortable for everybody. Most men don't even realize they're choosing comfort. They just feel like this is easier. She laughs at all his jokes, never questions his intentions, doesn't expect him to communicate when he shuts down. She lets him slide. She becomes a mirror that reflects back the man he is, not the man he could be. You were a mirror too, but you reflected the gaps, but work he still had to do to attempt. And that ain't easy to look at when a man ain't ready. This doesn't make her weak, and it doesn't make you better. It makes you different. It means you were operating from a place of self-worth. You weren't going to shrink just to make someone else feel tall, to attempt. You weren't going to settle for presence without purpose. You weren't going to lower the bar for love just to say you had someone. Tempt. And for a man who's used to skating by on charm and potential, that can feel threatening. So he runs, not toward her, but away from the responsibility that comes with being with you. And let's not pretend he didn't feel the difference. He felt it. He knew you were on another level. But some men aren't ready to climb that high. Some men are looking for a relationship where they can stay exactly as they are. And that's the comfort zone. That's what he chose. He didn't choose a woman. He chose relief. He chose the path of least resistance. He chose to be unchallenged because growth requires pain. Growth requires effort. And love with a woman who knows her value. That takes work. What hurts the most is that it feels personal. It feels like rejection. But often it's self-preservation on his part. He knows being with you means being seen, being exposed, being required to communicate, to commit, to lead with integrity, to attempt. You weren't just going to let him be a body next to you. You were going to ask him to be present. That's not comfortable. That's not casual. That's not convenient. So he chose her, not because she was more, but because she asked for less. She let him stay who he is. She didn't force him to reflect. She let him keep his excuses. She made him feel like he was enough without having to grow. That's comfort. It's not love. It's not deep, but it's familiar. And that's what he chose. Through attempt, you were too much woman for a man not ready to grow. That's a truth a lot of people don't want to hear because it feels like blame. But it's not about blame. It's about readiness. A man who isn't ready to grow will always feel overwhelmed by a woman who knows who she is, what she wants, and what she will not accept. And it's not that you were too much in a negative way. It's that your presence demanded elevation. You didn't just enter his life. You disrupted his patterns. You made him see the cracks in his foundation. And when a man isn't ready to do the work, he'll call the challenge too much rather than face the reality that he's not enough yet. See, being with a woman who knows her worth isn't easy for everybody. You walk with clarity. You speak truth. You see through games and you don't entertain confusion. That energy, it commands a certain kind of maturity a certain level of emotional depth, a certain responsibility in how someone shows up. And not every man is there. Some are still trying to figure out who they are. Some are still fighting their own demons. Some are still trying to feel like a man by chasing control instead of purpose. And when they stand in front of a woman who's already done her healing, or at least doing the work, they feel exposed. You didn't need him to complete you. You wanted partnership, not rescue. That scares some men because they've been conditioned to feel needed, to feel valued. But you didn't come broken. You came whole. You didn't want to be saved. You wanted to be met. And when a man isn't standing on solid ground himself, that can feel like pressure instead of potential. It can feel like a test he's not prepared to take. So rather than rise to meet you, he walks away. Not because you were wrong for asking, because he wasn't right with himself. You were emotionally available. You were intentional. You asked questions that mattered. You didn't just want to know how his day was. You wanted to know how his soul was doing. And that kind of connection, it doesn't live on the surface. It goes deep. It touches places some men have spent years avoiding. It shines a light into wounds they never planned to deal with. And when healing is unfamiliar, even love can feel like danger. You weren't asking for perfection. You were asking for growth. You were willing to walk with him through the process, but you couldn't drag him. You couldn't beg a man to want more for himself. And that's what it comes down to. You can love someone and still not lower yourself to fit inside their comfort zone because you've worked too hard to get where you are. You've cried, healed to attempt, evolved, forgiven, rebuilt. And now you know that peace isn't something you're willing to trade for potential. A woman like you isn't too much. She's just not meant for a man who's still hiding behind distractions. A man who's still looking for someone to make him feel like he's enough with ever doing the work to become it. A man who isn't ready to be real, to be raw, to be seen, and to be held accountable. Because being loved by a woman like you isn't a passive experience. It's transformational, and not everybody is ready to be transformed. He saw her validation, but feared your standards. That's the kind of truth that doesn't sit easy, but it's necessary to understand. Some men aren't looking for love. They're looking for approval. They're looking for someone to tell them they're good enough without requiring them to prove it through action, consistency, or character. And validation feels like safety to a man who's insecure, uncertain, or still building his sense of self. So when he's faced with two women, one who validates everything he does without question, and one who has standards, boundaries, and expectations, he'll often choose the one who makes him feel good, even if it's not good for him. You didn't just accept his words. You watched his behavior. You paid attention to the energy behind the actions. You didn't allow charm to replace consistency. And that intimidated him because some people are used to being loved for their potential. You weren't impressed by what he could be. You were paying attention to what he actually was. To attempt, that's the difference. You weren't offering blind support. You were offering accountability. You weren't clapping for empty promises. You were waiting for real action. And for a man who's not ready, that feels like pressure. That feels like being judged, even when it's not. That feels like exposure, even when you're just being honest. She made him feel like a king without requiring him to rule. She celebrated him for showing up, even if he wasn't fully present. She didn't challenge his inconsistencies. She absorbed them. She gave him applause before he earned it. And that kind of environment feels like love to someone who confuses validation with connection. But it's not love, it's comfort. It's emotional flattery. It's being seen, but not truly known. And to a man who fears being seen fully, that can feel safer than being in a relationship with someone who won't let him hide. Your standards weren't unrealistic. They were rooted in self-respect. You weren't asking for perfection. You were asking for alignment. You weren't demanding a finished man. You were asking for someone who was at least building. And you weren't judging his past. You were focused on his present choices. But to a man who isn't sure of himself, even healthy standards can feel like rejection because it reminds him that he hasn't arrived yet, that there's still work to do. That love isn't just a place to rest. It's a place to rise. Validation says, you're fine just as you are. Standards say, I see who you are, but I also see who you can be, and I expect you to move toward that. Validation is comfortable, but it's not always honest. Standards are uncomfortable, but they're rooted in truth. And when a man chooses validation over standards, he's not choosing love, he's choosing ease, attempt. He's choosing to be praised without being challenged. He's choosing to stay the same instead of becoming more. You weren't trying to control him. You were trying to build with him. You wanted growth, partnership, purpose. You wanted to know his dreams, not just his fears. You wanted to plan a future, not just survive the present. That required vision. That required him to show up. And that scared him because it meant the mask had to come off. The excuses had to stop. The games had to end. He wasn't ready for that. He wasn't ready for real. So he chose someone who made him feel like a man without having to become one. He saw her validation as love because it stroked his ego. But he feared your standards because they called his character forward. She fit his now. You challenge his future. That's the part most people don't see when they're trying to understand why someone was chosen over them. It's not always about who is better, smarter, more attractive, or more loving. Sometimes it's about timing. Sometimes it's about the level someone is operating at in their life. And if he's living in survival mode, chasing distraction, validation, or ego strokes, then a woman who fits into that lifestyle, who doesn't demand he think bigger or live deeper, will feel more aligned with where he is. You weren't just looking at who he is now. You saw who he could become. You saw the man, the mask, the leader behind the laziness to attempt, the potential behind the procrastination. And you didn't fall in love with his performance. You connected with his purpose. But when someone isn't ready to walk in purpose, even love can feel like pressure. You weren't content with just playing house. You were building a home. Emotionally, spiritually, and mentally. You weren't impressed with his presence. You wanted presence with intention. And that type of energy calls a man forward. That type of love is future focused. But if he's stuck in his past or afraid of his next, he'll run from anything that makes him confront what he hasn't healed or built. She fit into the life he's used to. The life that's unexamined, unstructured, and uncomplicated. Maybe she didn't ask where he was going. Maybe she didn't question his inconsistency. Maybe she was fine with half effort because she hadn't yet tasted what full effort looks like. And so he felt safe. He felt accepted. Not because she brought out the best in him, but because she let the worst in him stay untouched. And in the moment, that feels easier. That feels lighter. But it also feels stagnant, though he won't realize that until much later. You were the kind of woman who talks about vision boards, healing legacy, responsibility. You were speaking the language of future, and not just your own, but his too. You saw his patterns and didn't ignore them. You noticed the inconsistency and called it out. You gave him grace, but not excuses. And that kind of love, that's not passive. That's a mirror. That's a blueprint. That's a standard. It's not always soft, but it's always real. And real requires readiness. Real requires work. Men often confuse compatibility with comfort. She fit his now because she didn't make waves. You disrupted his rhythm, not of malice, but out of purpose. You weren't trying to control him, thing to attempt. You were trying to connect with the version of him that even he hadn't fully accessed yet. You believed in what was possible, not just what was present. But when someone is afraid of stepping into their full self, they'll reject anyone who reminds them of the gap between where they are and where they could be. To attempt. You weren't just a girlfriend, you were a catalyst. And not everyone is ready for that kind of partnership. Attempt. He chose what fit today because the weight of tomorrow felt too heavy. He chose what was easier to hold, not what was built to last. He chose the woman who didn't ask him to evolve because staying there felt safer. You represented a future that required focus, discipline, growth, and accountability. And if he's not prepared to rise to that level, he'll retreat to what's familiar, even if it's unfulfilling. Attempt, it wasn't rejection, it was redirection. But in the moment, it never feels that way. When someone you gave your time, energy, love, and vulnerability to chooses someone else, it cuts deep. It feels personal, like you weren't good enough, like you weren't chosen, like you were left behind. But sometimes what looks like rejection is really protection from a path that would have kept you small. Sometimes it's God, the universe, or your higher self stepping in and saying, not this, not him, not here. Because you weren't just looking for a title. You were looking for truth. You weren't just chasing a relationship. You were chasing something that felt aligned, something that honored your worth, something that helped you grow instead of keeping you stuck. But love, when it's not rooted in mutual respect and shared growth, becomes a burden, It becomes a place where you shrink just to keep peace. And that's not what you were created for. So even though it hurt when he didn't choose you, there's something bigger at play. He couldn't see your value, not because it wasn't there, but because he wasn't in a place to appreciate it. And that's not your fault. Some people are blind to blessings when they're handed something too good, too pure, or too whole, especially when they're not whole themselves. They look for cause because that's what they're familiar with. They choose comfort because growth feels threatening. And when you walked into his life, you represented elevation. You represented responsibility. You were the answer to prayers he wasn't even ready to pray yet. Rejection often stings because it challenges our ego. We think, why not me? What did I do wrong? But sometimes it's not about what you did. It's about what you wouldn't do. You wouldn't tolerate breadcrumbs. You wouldn't accept half love. You wouldn't sacrifice your peace just to say you had someone. And that refusal to settle, that's strength, that's self-respect, that's clarity. And sometimes people walk away because they realize they can't meet you where you are. They sense they'd have to grow, evolve, and show up. And not everyone is willing to do that work. When someone walks away or chooses another path, it creates space. And that space isn't empty. It's sacred. It's space for reflection, for realignment, for redirection, Because maybe you were pouring too much into someone who couldn't pour back. Maybe your energy was being drained in ways you hadn't even noticed until they left. Maybe you were asking for bare minimum just to feel seen. And now you get to reclaim your worth. Now you get to choose you again. And that's powerful. This wasn't a loss. It was a shift away from patterns that no longer serve you, a shift away from people who can't meet you in the light, a shift toward becoming the version of yourself that doesn't chase, doesn't beg, and doesn't break just to be accepted. Rejection makes room. It clears the path. It pushes you to sit with yourself and say, what I really want, what do I truly deserve? And when you answer that honestly, you start moving differently. You realize you were never asking for too much. You were just asking the wrong person. You thing to attempt. You realize that someone choosing someone else doesn't decrease your value. It just confirms they weren't the one capable of handling what you bring. Because your love is deep. Your heart is rare. Your standards are real. And anyone who walks away from that isn't rejecting you. They're declining the invitation to rise. And that's not on you. That's their decision, their limitation, their journey. Sometimes God removes the man to reveal the queen. It first feels like heartbreak. It feels like something precious was taken away from you like you lost the one thing you thought you needed. But what if the truth is you didn't lose anything? You were freed from it. What if the breakup, the betrayal, the unanswered questions were never meant to break you, but to wake you up to your own power? Because sometimes it takes being left to finally see yourself clearly. Sometimes it takes being rejected to recognize you've been dimming your light just to be loved in the dark. You were busy loving him, supporting him, showing up for him, sacrificing for him, all the while forgetting how deeply you deserve to be chosen, not just tolerated. You were bending, adjusting, compromising your standards just to keep the connection alive. You weren't just giving love, you were pouring from your soul. And in the process, somewhere along the line, you began to make him the center of your story. You made his needs more important than your peace, his potential more valuable than your boundaries. And that's not love. That's self-abandonment dressed up as loyalty. But God sees what we ignore. God hears the prayers we whisper in exhaustion, even when we pretend we're okay. And when you refuse to walk away from what's hurting you, sometimes the only option left is for God to shut the door himself, not because he wants to hurt you, but because he wants to heal you. He knows what you've settled for. He knows what you've tolerated. He knows the nights you cried and still smiled the next day. And sometimes, the only to bring out the queen in you is to remove the person who keeps treating you like a servant in your own kingdom. The removal wasn't rejection. It was a divine intervention, because you weren't created to chase, to beg, to constantly explain why you deserve respect. You were created to stand tall, to speak truth, to be loved without shrinking. But you can't rule a throne you keep giving away people who haven't earned it. You can't lead with purpose if you keep chasing people who are running in circles. And so when God steps in and removes someone, even if it's painful, even if it's messy, it's because he's about to take you somewhere that person can't follow. You weren't the problem. You were the mirror. And that man couldn't handle what he saw. He saw strength where he expected submission. He saw independence where he wanted control. He saw love, but he couldn't receive it because he was still fighting with the wounds of his past. And you can't heal someone who refuses to stop bleeding on people who didn't cut them. So God stepped in, not to punish you, but to promote you, not to take something away, but to make room for something greater. This is the moment where your identity shifts. This is the point where the queen rises. She doesn't beg. She doesn't chase. She doesn't water hers down to be digestible. She sits on her throne with clarity, discernment, and grace. She knows her value. She protects her peace. She attracts alignment, not confusion. But that version of you couldn't come life while you were still holding on to someone who didn't see your worth. So God removed the man, not to break your heart, but to break the illusion, to wake you up to the royalty that's always lived inside you, to remind you that the love you've been trying to give to someone else, that love belongs to you first. So let me tell you something, and I want you to hear me loud and clear. He didn't choose you, and that's okay, because what he didn't choose was the discipline, the depth, the divinity inside you. He walked away from something he wasn't man enough to handle, not something that wasn't worthy. You are not too much. He was just never enough for the woman you're becoming. And the next time you start to question your value because somebody couldn't see it, I want you to stop, look in the mirror, and remind yourself queens don't chase, queens don't compete, and queens don't settle. Let them choose what's easier. You keep becoming what's rare. And when the right one comes along, the man who's healed, whole, and ready, you won't have to prove, perform, or persuade. He'll recognize you as the crown he's been praying for until things fix your crown, sis. And don't you ever lower it for a man who was never meant to sit next to your throne.